We're starting a new series every Wednesday and Thursday. It's titled Church and Leaders versus New Testament. This is part 1. Hello, everybody. I'm Jim McCotter. And we have pictured here a lion and a lamb. The lion and lamb display two characteristic qualities of God's New Testament spiritual leaders. Like a lion, bold and fearless; like a lamb, gentle and humble. After 2,000 years of historically accumulated church traditions, some of the most basic biblical truths have been smothered over with layers of theological, bureaucratic mishmash. Today's church gatherings are nothing like they were in the New Testament. Today's church leadership model is nothing like it was in the New Testament. Worse yet, as biblically obvious as this is, most spiritual leaders today either don't see the obvious or more likely don't want to see it. And why is this so important? It should be enough to say because God thought it important enough to have it written down in His eternal word, the Bible. And here are some of the tragic implications of not following the New Testament model and instruction. It greatly suppresses and retards, number 1, most every believer's spiritual maturity, producing spiritual midgets. Number 2, numerical church growth and multiplication. Number 3, multiplying strong spiritual leaders. Number 4, fulfilling national and world evangelization. Number 5, Christianizing national cultures. Now, are you ready to see this addressed biblically? If so, it will necessitate you being like a Berean, quote, open-minded and eager to learn, end quote. Acts 17:11 says, and I quote, "And the people of Berea were more open-minded than those in Thessalonica, and they listened eagerly to Paul's message. They searched the scriptures day after day to see if Paul and Silas were teaching the truth," end quote. The Pharisees never wanted to change their traditions. Jesus said they had eyes but could not see, and ears but could not hear. So here we go. If you're a non-Pharisee, this section is titled Elders. We are going to start with spiritual leadership of elders because that is where all New Testament leaders started before receiving their spiritual gifts of apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, and teacher, as read in Ephesians chapter 4, and as which we will look into as we go through this series to see why and how all the spiritual leaders first were recognized as qualified elders. Defining new elders. First, look at what the biblical word elder does not mean. Biblically, it did not mean physically or old or physically older. However, it did mean spiritually older and mature. Most New Testament spiritual leaders in their beginning days were in their 20s or even in their teens. So you certainly don't have to be physically old to be a spiritual leader, to be an elder. Jesus was 30 when He started His ministry. One of the first things He started doing was recruiting His disciples. The Greek word for disciple means pupils or students. In a couple years, Jesus had recruited, trained, and sent out 12 of His disciples, calling them apostles, to preach to the cities all over Israel. Jesus, being only 30 years old when He started, meant that all His students, disciples, would have for sure been younger, in their 20s and even teens. According to Exodus 30:13 and 14, only those older than age 20 were required to pay the 2 drachma taxes. The fact that Jesus only paid the tax to cover Himself and Peter might indicate that Peter was the only one of Jesus' 12 students who were older than 20. Moreover, Peter's the only disciple that we know was married at that time, suggesting the others being in their teens, which would have been most common at that time. First-century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus wrote that most Jewish boys were married by the time they were in their 20s. Jewish boys were considered adult men in their teens. We know John, the apostle, was no doubt a very young teenager because of how he was referred to in the Gospels. Additionally, it is understood that John wrote the book of Revelation around 95 AD, making it necessary for John to have been a very young teenager when Jesus chose him and when he was sent out as an apostle. So we know all Jesus' spiritual leaders were very young men. We also know the apostle Paul had very young men with him who he appointed as apostles. Paul told Timothy, 1 Timothy 4, verse 12, quote, "Let no one look down on your youthfulness," end quote. Paul wrote this while Timothy was admonishing and teaching churches and giving the qualifications for his appointing of new elders, 1 Timothy 3:1. Moreover, 10 years before Paul wrote 1 Timothy, Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians and recognized Timothy then as a fellow apostle, 1 Thessalonians 1:1 and chapter 2, verse 6. Now, sometime prior to writing 1 Thessalonians, Paul, in 2 Timothy 1:6, through the laying on of my hands, end quote, had appointed Timothy as a fellow apostle. And at least 2 years prior to 1 Thessalonians, and before Paul even picked Timothy up to travel with him, Timothy had been appointed as a fellow elder in his home city, church of Lystra. 1 Timothy 4:14, when the elders of the church laid their hands, end quote, on Timothy. In light of all the above, without question, Timothy had to be in the beginning of his teen years when he was first appointed as a fellow elder. It's also evident that Titus and Silas were also very young, unmarried men. Most all of Paul's fellow apostles were very young men. No New Testament leaders went to Bible schools or seminaries. There were none, and for good reason. They are poor substitutes at best compared to how New Testament leaders were trained and raised up. All New Testament leaders were raised up on-the-job training, quote, working together with one another with one mind and purpose, end quote. Working together for what? To evangelize their city, and, quote, equipping believers for the work of service, end quote, Ephesians 4:12. Why is today's unbiblical Bible school learning model not found in the Bible? Because such a learning model is counterproductive to its very purpose in two ways. It fosters, one, deception. James 1, verse 22 says, quote, "But prove yourselves doers of the word and not just hearers who deceive themselves," end quote. The school model may be okay for secular learning, but not spiritual learning. If you sit in a Bible classroom taking notes for 2 or 4 years before you plan to obey, you're not only disobeying this verse in James 1:22, but you're one of those who, quote, deceive themselves, end quote. You can be an A student studying books on flying an airplane for 2 or 4 years and graduate with a pilot's certificate, but only a fool would get in an airplane with such a person as a pilot like that. Yet churches hire, quote, pilot graduates, end quote, to lead their churches all the time because they are a good, quote, pilot talker, end quote. They've got a degree. Jesus said in John 12:35, "Walk while you have the light, lest darkness overtake you." Jesus said the same thing as James, quote, "Walk while you have the light," end quote. Not 2 years later, lest you'll be walking in darkness. Not maybe, but lest you will be walking in darkness if you don't apply it and do it when you learn it. Jesus said in Matthew 4:19, "Follow me, and I'll make you a fisher of men." Jesus did not say, sit down and take notes for the next 3 years, and then I'll send you out to preach. No, he said, follow me. It's impossible to be like a New Testament leader when not following the New Testament model and instruction. The above verses are only a few revealing the obvious on this subject. The second reason it's counterproductive, the school model, is because it makes arrogance. 1 Corinthians 8:1 says, "But while knowledge makes us feel important It is love that strengthens the church, end quote. Other translations say, knowledge makes one conceited, or, but knowledge puffs up, end quote. And the word knowledge here in Greek is gnos, which means intellectual knowledge. Proverbs 11:2 says, when pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. That's different than knowledge. The Apostle Paul prayed in Philippians chapter 3, verse 10, quote, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection, the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death. The word know here is much different in the Greek, gnosko. It means to have an experiential knowledge of him, an experiential knowledge of his power, an experiential knowledge of his sufferings, not just an intellectual knowledge. David said in Psalms 11, verse 10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. All those who follow his commandments have a good understanding, end quote. Not those who know his commandments, but those who follow them. They're the ones, all of them, have a good understanding. The New Testament leadership model had enormous implication in raising up young spiritual leaders. The New Testament goal, as we will see as we continue to go through this series, it was for all young Christian men to grow up spiritually and become spiritual leaders. This was necessary then and today to be able to, quote, turn the world upside down for Christ as they did. This was the clear New Testament picture of the first century Christians, as they in fact were reaching the whole world, as all the following scriptures confirm. Acts 9:35, Acts 17:6 through 7, Acts 24:5, Romans 1:8, Romans 16:25 through 27, 1 Corinthians 4:9, and Colossians 1:6 and Colossians 1:23, and 1 Thessalonians 1:8 and 1 Timothy 3:16. New Testament Christianity was an enormous worldwide lay movement driven by non-professional young men, spiritual leaders. All spiritual leaders were elders, overseers, one and the same. All apostles and prophets were elders, confirmed by the Apostle Peter. In 1 Peter 5:1, he calls the elders, saying he too is also an elder. And the Apostle John in 2 John 1:1 and 3 John 1:1, each place he says, I'm an elder, I'm an elder. All apostles, prophets, pastors, are also shepherds. They're teachers, they're overseers or bishops. So all pastors, teachers, overseers are all the same men in Scripture, only being described by their different functions, which they all did. They were also all elders. Acts 20:17 and 28, 1 Peter 5:1 and 2 confirm all of this. All elders were teaching. 1 Timothy 3:1 and 2, 1 Timothy 5 and verse 17 makes it very clear, as well as Titus 1:5 and verse 9. The elder's job was to teach, not to administrate. Deacons served in administrating, and elders, quote, to be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching, end quote. 1 Timothy 5:17 and Acts 6:2 through 4. Why was it critically important that every spiritual leader was first qualified as an elder? God wanted to make sure every one of his spiritual leaders were godly and spiritually mature prior to giving any spiritual leadership responsibility or authority. God gave 17 clear and very objective qualifications for being an elder, which we will look at later. Every Wednesday and Thursday, Church and Leaders versus New Testament. Tomorrow, Part 2.